emotional subject, has been so forever, from the time of India's freedom struggle. We know that the subcontinent, the independence of the subcontinent came with a terrible wound. India was wounded at the two flanks, and people with shared history, people with shared history, shared culture, shared language, were deliberately separated on the constructed belief of separation on the issue of religion. It was a constructed idea that these two communities, the majority communities in India, in the subcontinent, the Hindus and the Muslims, had irreconcilable differences, which is totally constructed by the colonizers, and a poison tree was planted, the poison tree of communalism. I recall, and you too would, I think, in 2014, while talking about the First World War, recalling the First World War, Mr. Shashi Tharoor gave an extraordinary discussion, an extraordinary lecture in London to British legislators who were talking about reparation, how colonizers can make reparations. We know reparations about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Pearl Harbor have been attempted. But truly, can the colonizers make reparations for the trauma, for the horrific violence, for the death and devastation that the partition caused? It threw up words like displacement, refugee, relocation. These are such, innocuous words. They do not convey the pain of displacement and rootlessness. In Bengali, there is a word called udbastu. That means homeless, rootless, forced to move, forced migration, forced exile from homeland, from places that one still call home. And there's these kind of attached sentiments to those places, nostalgia for those places that still endure. So partition is a very emotional subject with us in the subcontinent even now. Why are we talking about partition in 2016? Books are coming out still. Isn't partition forgotten? It is not. We know Indian writers in English like Tutun Saint, like Amitabh Ghosh, Atiya Hussain, Bapsi Sidhwa, written memorable narratives made into films also. There are even more number of stories, narratives in the regional languages. And the partition continues to invite scholars to engage with it still. South Asia certainly has not experienced this kind of devastation and loss and pain and trauma that endures even now. Urvashi Butalia's very good book talks about children. There are narratives of women who have been the target of unthinkable, unimaginable violence. Very often, gendered violence on the basis of gender has become the victim of this kind of violent interjections of the theorists. So there have been all kinds of writings still continuing. Our panelists have engaged with the question of partition now, 2015-16. Why? Because of the aftermath that continues. It is not evaporated, not vanished, gone away. Not forgotten. It's a wound not to be forgotten. And the aftermath, the legacy of this poison, the fruit of the poison tree, is still being reaped. Communalism is among us like a, spreading poison, vitiating our lives. So these panelists are going to talk about their engagement with this wound. America still bears the wound of the Civil War. Not forgotten. Holocaust. These cannot be forgotten. So too the partition. It's a kind of a breach, a disruption in our continuous, life of continuity. A people, as I said, of shared past, torn asunder by force. So I would invite our panelists who have done some work to talk about their work. Tarun Saint is an independent scholar. He is the author of Witnessing Partition, 2010. He is the editor of Brui's Memories, Communal Violence and the Writer, 2002, and co-editor with Rita Kothari of Translating Partition, 2001, and with others, looking back the 1947 partition, 70 years on. So he should be able to answer all the questions that you might have on his work that he has done with the partition. He has lived a long time with these stories of the partition. Tarun, I invite you to.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thank you for those kind introductory remarks. It's a pleasure to be at the Hyderabad Literary Festival. I was delighted to be invited here, and especially happy given the fact that Hyderabad is one of the places I had never visited. So it's for me a real experience of discovery of the charm of this city, which had its own connection to partition, which I'm sure everyone is well aware of. But let me begin my brief presentation, after which, of course, I'll hand over the floor to Rita. So, not taking too much time. With reference to the title, you've all sort of seen the title as it's printed, and it's not our choice, it was chosen by the organizers. It's a very apt choice, I thought. Looking back, but not in anger. But it could, a sort of title of session which lends itself to interesting possibilities for debate. I was personally reminded immediately of John Osborne's play, Look Back in Anger, which is a play written in 1956, featuring as its central character an angry young man, Jimmy Porter. Osborne's play inspired a generation of radical playwrights in Britain, such as David Hare and Howard Brenton. And it just so happens that Howard Brenton, has recently written a play on the partition, Drawing the Line. I think it's the first major dramatic treatment of the high politics leading up to the transfer of power. Apart from the issues which we've already been discussing, the issues of displacement and suffering of the common folk. But yes, he's the first dramatist to actually take up the subject of the political debates leading up to the decision to partition the country, and featuring as the central character Cyril Radcliffe. I'm sure many people are aware who he was. He was the lawyer chosen to head the Boundary Commission at a very late date with very little knowledge of India. So he was sent by the then Labour government in Britain, who had decided to concede the demand for independence, but also decided upon the partitioning of the country. So he was the one who then, along with representatives from the different religious communities, actually drew the national boundaries as we know them, in that context, of course, between India and Pakistan before the advent of Bangladesh. Now, Cyril Radcliffe did his job with great difficulty, and W.H. Auden wrote a satirical poem titled Partition about him. In this poem, he sort of caricatures Radcliffe as a person with very superficial knowledge of India, who comes here, falls ill all the time, does his job in a rather hasty way, and burns his papers and returns to his homeland, upon which he is conferred a knighthood. And that's really what did happen. The demarcation of boundaries happened on the basis, purportedly, of principles of demographic majority and contiguity, but of course very little groundwork was done given the speeding up of the process, and there was very little understanding of the situation in the border regions. So Brenton's play humanizes Radcliffe to an extent, showing the difficult choice he faced given the political pressures of the time as well as the severe time constraints imposed upon him. At one point in the play, and this is fascinating for us as readers from the subcontinent, he even summons Krishna to his aid, like Arjun on the battlefield of the Mahabharata, who advises him, of course, to follow his karmic duty. But more interestingly, that is sort of one of the sort of interesting interludes in this play, if you have the chance to read it. This play was staged in Leicester City in 2013 and was live streamed. So you could actually sit in India, in Delhi or Calcutta or Hyderabad, and view the play on YouTube because of the fact that it was being live streamed for just 48 hours. So it's no longer, unfortunately, accessible in its stage version. But the play, yes, one can read the play, which I've done. So it's pretty unsparing in its treatment of all the political heavyweights, whether it's Cyril Radcliffe himself as the central figure, who's treated, however, with a degree of sympathy. But yes, Clement Attlee, the head of the Labour Party, Lord Louis Mountbatten in particular, some pretty severe criticism, and then also the Indian leaders, including Jinnah, Nehru and Gandhi. But this is not the time and place for a full-fledged literary critical analysis of the play. I just thought I would mention that because one can sort of trace a lineage there, therefore, of, yes, angry playwrights. So anger does occasionally have its uses, from, say, John Osborne's time to, say, Brenton. Anger in its sort of sublimated form, in its artistic form, can have its uses. And anger can also be sublimated in the form of satire. And as we'll see in the case of some of the writings from the subcontinent, that is style often resorted to by partition writers. So let me return to this then central theme, the partition at 70. Why do we then address the subject of partition in 2017? And I'll address it from my vantage point as the co-editor, as just mentioned, of a forthcoming volume with several with friends who are helping me in this particular anthology. The question of the recovery of the memory of this traumatic historical event became crucial as one observed a resurgence of interest in survivor memories. The work of feminist historians, as was just mentioned, like Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon, and Kamala Bhasin in oral history, had opened up a space for recording survivor accounts, often including disturbing incidents of sexual violence. Such investigations, which were launched, interestingly enough, in the wake of the 1984 experience of this pogrom of the Sikhs in Delhi. So people were trying to investigate why the 84 events could play out the way they did in independent India. Is there any link with the past, partition, and its sort of history of violence? So this paved the way for the emergence of an alternative archive of memory. Today, after 70 years, it's as if the silence and selective amnesia about the partition trauma, it's as if that has abated to the extent that two projects of archiving memory are underway coterminously. There is the Berkeley-based initiative headed by Gunita Singh Bhalla. They are attempting to create a virtual archive, a digital record of partition memory. They're conducting thousands of interviews with partition survivors. I'm sure they have reached Hyderabad and they've met members of the Sindhi community who came here after 1947 as well, besides others. Then there is the proposed Partition Museum, which is being constructed in Amritsar. This was conceived of by Kishore Desai. They are also collecting memorabilia, photographs, and they are also recording stories. So it's almost as if we are sort of moving from an earlier phase, which was one of deliberate silence and a kind of conscious willing of, as it were, or rather an amnesiac kind of approach, to the opposite, a phase of hyperamnesia, a kind of excess of memory. Hyperamnesia is a condition in which we are flooded with memories which refuse to disappear. It's as if those memories constantly haunt us or cause us to feel a certain sense of disturbance which doesn't allow us to live in the present. We're always living in the past. But yes, certainly for sure, those memories are now being reflected upon as well. So this has replaced then the earlier silence about the suffering undergone by the 10 to 15 million people displaced. I mean, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the statistics, which I don't need to go over, but yes, 1 million people killed, 10 to 15 million people displaced, and of course, more than 75,000 women abducted or raped. So this brings to the fore, to me as a researcher, Susan Sontag's question about the need for an ethic of remembrance. Memory, yes, but to what end? For traumatic memory can become a trigger for affects like narcissistic rage and humiliated fury. So those are unproductive forms of anger, if you will, forms of anger which can actually lead to retaliatory manifestations of violence. This obviously lessens the chances of reconciliation. And unfortunately, this seems to be the dominant trend. If you go on to, say, any website, Indo-Pak website, and you watch the kind of exchanges that take place there, you eavesdrop on some of the exchanges that take place there, the predominant note is one of hatefulness. People don't seem to be able to see eye to eye on anything. And there's an immediate tendency to lapse back into set ideas about the self and the other, us and them. So that sense of polarization, which perhaps came to being in the form of, yes, communal forms of ideology at the time of the partition, has now acquired a new kind of tonality in the context of subcontinental, rival subcontinental nationalisms. Now, partition writings, which has been the subject of my research, as I just mentioned, for some time, at their best, refuse the rhetoric of blame, or the comforting kind of reassurance of redemption narratives. We can think of Saadat Hasan Manto, perhaps the most brilliant writer, in his work like, for example, Black Margin, Siyah Hashiye, or his satirical masterpiece, Toba Tek Singh, another very good illustration of this idea about how anger may be sublimated artistically, or in his fictive memoir about his arrival in Lahore from Bombay, Savere Kal Jo Meri Aankh Khuli, which has been translated as A Stroll in the New Pakistan, where at one point he goes to a garden and he sees these people walking about in this famous garden known as Lawrence Bagh in Lahore, and these people seem not to be able to absorb the beauty of nature around them because they're caught up in a situation of trauma. They're like living corpses to him. So when he emerges from that particular garden, which has been renamed as Jinnah Bagh rather than Lawrence Bagh, it's as if to him, as if he has emerged from a kind of hell-like situation. So Manto is someone who is extremely critical of jingoistic forms of nationalism, of very aggressive forms of nationalism, and he used irony and satire to very good effect. So he, in a way, opens up the space for partition writing to imaginatively come to terms with the historical trauma of 1947. Other writers I may briefly mention, since I'm running out of time: Atiya Hussain, Intizar Hussain, P. Shamsani, and of course Anita Desai, whose remarkable novel Clear Light of Day actually features a character who has to flee Delhi as a result of the communal tensions of the time, and he chooses not to go to Pakistan but instead comes to Hyderabad. So I thought this would be the fitting place to mention that particular novel, one of the classic narratives about partition. And many of these narratives, obviously, they are now being refracted through the lens of memory. Since time has elapsed, Manto's generation was the first generation, Khushwant Singh too belonged to the first generation, but after that you have these second generation and third generation narratives coming. So I think, yes, one can notice a certain degree of perhaps abatement also of the violent passions of the time, a more dispassionate view perhaps, a more critical engagement with partition is becoming possible. I saw especially instances of this in Vishwajyoti Ghosh's anthology of graphic narratives, This Side, That Side, Restoring Partition, which was an attempt to bring together in a collaborative vein artists and writers from all three countries, India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. So you might have a writer based in Lahore and the artist who provides the graphic illustrations based in Delhi. There is no one truth to partition. There is no one way of understanding partition. I think the multiple ways in which partition history have to be understood are borne out in this anthology, which also includes this dimension of transcendence of the narrow boundaries, which of course were created at the time when, of course, the Radcliffe Commission was doing its work and when the Radcliffe line, as it was then known, was drawn. I'll end by just referring to one of the pieces from that collection. My own work is still being shaped, so it's still to come. Hopefully our anthology should be out by August. But Kaiser Haq is one of the contributors. But I'm thinking of an earlier poem titled Border, which is absolutely remarkable. A poem which celebrates desire. The protagonist ultimately reaches the border, lies down on the border, and raises the flag of the universal flag, and I'm quoting the poem here, he raises the universal flag of flaglessness. So it's almost as if there's an attempt at arriving at a kind of transcendental perception, the transcendence of borders, maybe perhaps in imaginative terms, but yes, certainly the border has, as a result, become more fluid, more permeable. And of course, this is a poet from Dhaka, from Bangladesh. And at this given moment, for him to actually bring in such a perspective, perhaps becomes even more salient.
Thank you very much, Tarun. That's just introduction to his work. I have the pleasure now of inviting Rita Kothari. She is a practitioner and theorist of translation. Actually, I know Rita for theories of translation, which our students also use. But now she has gone deeply into the study of partition literature, and she has this, your booklet will give you all the names of her books, namely The Burden of Refuge, Partition, Sindh, Gujarat, 2007, Memories and Movements, Borders and Communities in Banni, Kutch. Some of these books are there in our bookstall here at HLF. And then she's also co-editor of Checkifying English. So that is another interest, talking about English and translation. Decentering Translation Studies, India and Beyond. I just bought the book, Rita. So this is 2009 publication, somehow I missed it, and several others. So it's a pleasure inviting Rita now to talk.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll sit here. Thank you so much, Tutun. Given the paucity of time, it's going to be difficult for me to give you a snapshot of the preoccupations I have had about partition over almost 17 years now. I've been working on partition since the late 1990s, which is over 3 books and numerous articles and so on. So I didn't sort of go into partition now, but it has been a continuous strand along with my work. However, my own understanding of partition has certainly undergone a shift from partition with a capital P, as in a historical event that took place, that had a temporal dimension to it at a certain period of time, to partition with a lowercase, as in divisions of different kinds, borders of very different kinds, that continue to obtain, that continue to inform everyday life in India. And whether I examine that in the Hindu and the Muslim relationship in Gujarat, or whether I examine that in the way certain languages, certain spaces, certain cities, nation states came to be reconstituted and reconfigured and continue to do so. So my concern with partition has sort of broadened and widened in a way that, in some sense, the question is not about what happened or what happened then, but the question is what are its ramifications, and more importantly, what might be our prisms for seeing them, what might be our lenses for understanding them. So what I'll do is I'll sort of quickly go over simply a couple of very, very short episodes, narratives from my own work, to simply give you an idea of some of the questions that I asked. So I'm taking you now to an aunt of mine who passed away. I had taken her to a homeopath. It was around late 1990s. She had 10 children. Very few had survived. She had not gone to school. She was born in Sindh. I'm a Sindhi myself. And my family comes from the region of Shikarpur in Sindh. I take her to a homeopath, and very often, as is the tradition in homeopathic medicine, they ask you questions about आपको गुस्सा आता है, फिर आप क्या करते हो, फिर आप कैसे करते हो, आपको नींद ठीक से आती है कि नहीं आती. The homeopath is asking these questions. How many children do you have? बहुओं के साथ आपका रिश्ता कैसा है? फिर आप कहाँ बड़े हुए? And she says Sindh mein? So the homeopath looks at her and he says, तो आप यहाँ कब आए? When did you come here? And she said, जब हिंदुस्तान पाकिस्तान हुआ. Because we do not have a word for partition. And this is another very interesting thing, how different languages have very, very different terminology to describe Batwara or partition. And sometimes the words are so euphemistic, almost as if as a civilization we were not prepared for an event of this nature. And she says, जब हिंदुस्तान पाकिस्तान हुआ. And the doctor nods very sagely and he says, अच्छा अच्छा 1947 में आए. She looks at him in puzzlement and she says, आपको कैसे पता चला? Almost as if to say that sometimes you go through history, but you don't know the historical details. And this is particularly true sometimes of women. In my interviews with partition migrants who are women, they would very often use passive construction. They would very often not give me details of the trains they took the day they left or the ships they took. Unlike people in the Punjab, people from Sindh very often took ships and came to the harbors of Gujarat and Bombay. And you would not find these logistical details in women's accounts, but you will find everyday small quotidian accounts of घर पे कौन आता था, who cooked, and how we would go to a Muslim's wedding, but we would not have cooked food there. We would ask them कि हमको कच्चा खाना दे दो, and we will go and cook that at our house. This is just one instance to tell you how very, very fine-grained issues are involved in partition scholarship, issues that have to do with gender, issues that have to do with class, whether somebody took a flight from Delhi to Lahore and was a bureaucrat who found, or Lahore to Delhi, and found a corresponding job here, his experience is likely to be vastly different from the one who has taken a train, from the one who has come and lived in a refugee camp, and so on and so forth, because very often class can also fortify you and barricade you against history. Let me now take you to another instance. This is the year 2002. You know what Gujarat was in 2002. And I was in conversation with Maya Kodnani, again a name that should be familiar to some of you, right? For the massacres that happened at the Naroda Patia, one of the worst cases in Gujarat. She's a Sindhi, I'm a Sindhi, and I managed to get an interview with her through people who knew us in common. I did not tell her, and I'm sure in an American university this would not pass any ethics test, which is why I work in India, I don't work in the US. And I go to her and I told her that, you know, I'm writing a book about women achievers in our community, because there are, I want to know where did you grow up and what made you such a successful person in politics. These were also my questions leading up to her own role in the Naroda Patia massacre. And what comes out very clearly from that conversation, which has been published, is how she was the child of an RSS person, grew up in a small town in Gujarat, in Disa, grew up with the feeling that the Muslims drove us away from Sindh, and when we came to Gujarat, we looked like Muslims to them. We wore certain kinds of clothes. Our Sindhi script is written in the Perso-Arabic manner. Even now, when I exclaim, I end up saying Allah, or I end up saying Satnam Shri Vaheguru, because Sikhism and Islam have a very huge influence on us Sindhis. These are influences that are very consciously, very systematically and being taken away, and there is a kind of de-Islamicization happening at several levels, but that's a different question. And so she felt that there was almost a double whammy, that not only were you driven out of your homeland where you left everything behind, you come to the home state, you come to Gujarat, and people think you are quasi-Muslims. So, and this is what she says, we have to become more Hindu than the Hindus. The significance of this statement, I leave you to assess and judge. I'm taking you now to another part of Gujarat, and interestingly, Gujarat is not seen as one of the partition regions, right? We always think of places in the north, or we might think places in Bengal. But this is the thing about partition, that it left very few parts of India untouched, and I do believe that Gujarat has been informed by partition in extremely profound ways. On the border, of Gujarat, where it touches the run of Kutch, where now you have the famous Ranotsav going on, which is a major feather in the cap of our previous chief minister. And you have here this desert festival. In the villages where this happens, you have 22 Sunni Muslim pastoral communities who live there in the region of Banni. They have not undergone, like my parents did, the partition of 1947. These are cattle breeders who spent some time on this side of the pasture when it rained and went over to that side of the pasture when it rained there. It is only with the promulgation of the border in the mid-1970s that their partition happened. So I want to bring this to your notice to say, do not think of partition only as something that happened in 1947. For the pastoralists of Banni, the fact that partition did not generate their movement and their migration and an exodus, but in fact it arrested their movement. The fact that they could not move, that is the trauma of partition for them. And it happens much later, and it is not likely to go in a textbook example of partition trauma. So what is partition trauma? I do believe that it is far more complex than a certain kind of mechanical and a rhetorical way by which it gets repeated over and over again. In my own community, for instance, you will seldom find people who spend much time wanting to think over it. It's a mercantile community that told itself it had to move on. It emerged as model immigrants that made it its business to forget partition. Tutunji mentioned earlier about a wound that is not forgotten. I'm talking of a wound that was too easily forgotten. A wound that was too easily repressed, to the extent that I remember interviewing one of my uncles and I'm asking him, on 6 January 1948, which is the first time that the region of Sindh witnessed riots. Until then, during partition, what were considered as the heydays of partition, there were no riots in the region of Sindh. On 6 January, I'm asking him, so Dada, taan chapya kayo mali? What were you doing on that day? And he said to me that it was very scary. I wanted to take a ship and leave. And it was very scary to go out in the city. And I'm asking, so then what happened? And he said, kuch na thyo. Mahal picture bhi thi. I went and watched a movie. He went and watched the film Mahal, and for the rest of the time, he narrated the story of the film Mahal to me. Does that mean he did not undergo the experience, or does that trauma have a different manifestation depending on who you are and where you come from and what has been historically the nature of your community? So with this, I simply want to emphasize that I think there are very, very finer nuances to the whole business of partition, and there is a much more complex issue of non-temporality to it that we need to take cognizance of. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we've had two talks on the continuing impact of partition, whether forgotten or repressed, and whether part of amnesia or hyperamnesia. So there are all these questions that you keep in mind that you want to ask the panelists. I want to put in a word for Bengal partition here. Bengal partition, Amitabh Ghosh has talked about Bengal partition in several of his books. But this concept of class, we've been talking about gender. I want to bring in the question of class also. There are some friends of ours, Dalit friends of ours, who came into India through Sundarbans. I'm talking about porous borders. Okay, porous borders. I remember a film which talked about Nadia, Panchi. They do not, are not restricted by borders. Here also I'm talking about porous borders in Bengal. Recently there was some exchange of, these little islands and plots of land, etc., that has not built a wall, okay, between the two Bengals, and Bengal continues to call itself West Pushchim Bangla, West Bengal, because always remember the part which is a part of us. East Bengal is a part of us. That's our homeland. Dalits came into West Bengal and they were settling in Sundarban. they were forced by left-front government, unfortunately at that time, to move after a devastating another displacement. You know, this is double displacement. It's called Morid Chhapi. Morid Chhapi is the place where this painful double displacement took place, and they were pushed to Dandakaranya. It reminded me of Native Americans being pushed to reservations, where they find a kind of a drought, kind of a land bare, which would not be able to sustain them. So, and there were many of them were pushed to refugees. They say that the class was obvious because many of the upper class people were rehabilitated in Kolkata area, suburban area, which is now very much a part of main Kolkata. It was called Netaji Colony, refugee colony, Netaji Colony, where the upper class people settled. And the Dalits were pushed into refugee camps and also moved by forcibly to Andaman and Morid Chhapi Dandakaranya. So there are so many, I'm so grateful to them who have pointed out these different nuances, these different levels that still need to be investigated. Enough of my talk, and we await your questions.
From Punjab. My parents also came in that side of Punjab. We refer to that Punjab, just you refer to Bengal, and that is Western Punjab. Two types of people mainly I thought that they came from other side. One was from farming community and other was from business community. My question is about the response of the people here who received these people from the other side. Whenever we mention about partition, we go on to blame the people from the other side who shunted them out. But the fact of the partition on this side of Punjab was that those people having the same religion or even having same caste, they are considered other. Even now, there are no marriages, no relationships with them, and this hatred continues now even. What do you think about this effect of partition when the people came here and settled down here and they are still considered the other? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. Punjab is a very interesting case in point, and the difference between the Eastern Partition and the Punjab Partition is precisely that, in effect, in one fell swoop, there was a kind of almost what amounted to an ethnic cleansing. In West Punjab, all Hindus and Sikhs left and came across the border or were killed. And in East Punjab too, what amounts to again a form of ethnic cleansing, except one district, Malar Kotla, which I'm sure you know of, because there was a Nawab of Malar Kotla once upon a time, apparently in the time of Guru Gobind Singh. The story goes that he had written a letter of protest when the sons of Guru Gobind Singh were to be bricked up and killed. So he had written a letter of protest to the then emperor in Delhi. So as a result, there's never been a sense of communal animosity in Malar Kotla and no violence. Even during the worst of partition violence, Malar Kotla became a sanctuary in fact. People from the surrounding districts came there, and the border zones around this district actually became a kind of killing, or the border of the district became a kind of killing zone. So you can actually go there and see fields where bodies were piled up and then immolated or buried, as was recently discovered by Ajay Bhardwaj. So to some extent, therefore, rehabilitation measures were more effective in the Punjab. And yes, people did open their homes and hearths to their relatives, but in many cases also people had to suffer from this sense of taint of being a Sharnarthi, a refugee in that sense. It was seen to be someone you would not get your daughter married into that family. So that persisted for about a generation, and I think that too has begun to abate. But I think there's another problem which perhaps we're more reluctant to deal with. The fact that, just a very quick completion of the point, which is that many of the victims of violence on the other side came to this side and they became perpetrators. So this duality, we're only now beginning to acknowledge that our sense of victimhood can sometimes easily be transformed into this kind of grey zone of experience in which we find that become a rationale or a justification for killing people on the other side of the border where we found security.
Just to make a point regarding Rita's presentation, what she said that people forget the unpleasant memories. That is a common phenomena happening after each riots or the partition. I have been myself part of the partition. First time when my grandparents came from Lahore, settled in Srinagar and Shimla. Second time from Kashmir again they were resettled, they came to Shimla again. And third time myself I had to suffer it. I was in MS University Baroda from 1996 to 2003. And I have undergone the situation. And each time what happens is, person tries to forget the memories subconsciously, consciously. So it is partial amnesia, not a total amnesia.
Any other questions?
Good afternoon. I just wanted to ask, do you think a day will come when everything will be sorted out and everything will be fine? You can go to areas.
Sweetie, we are researchers, not clairvoyants, so I wouldn't know how to answer that question.
My question is to Tarun ji. I just wanted to find out, is there any partition writing in English coming out of the Eastern Partition? I mean, there are so many well-known writers and books and everything about the Western Partition. And there is some stuff in the vernacular. But in English, I mean, you're a researcher, you would know, I don't, so.
She's asking about fiction. Fiction, yeah. Actually, perhaps I'm actually not the best person to answer this question because I didn't really focus on the Eastern Partition in my research. But I learned from my friends like Devdani, who's Sengupta, who's my co-editor for this forthcoming volume, that from a sort of that we can actually think of the Eastern Partition as having happened in waves. And yes, so since there was the wave of migration after 47, and then after the first Indo-Pak War, and even after 71, so there have been waves of migration rather than one sort of cataclysmic event which ruptured the historical continuum, as we were discussing earlier. But apart from that, on the question of the fictional representation, well, Kaiser Huq's poem is in English, the writer from Dhaka I just mentioned, and Tehmina Anam, a writer from Bangladesh. In some of her writings, you do get a sense of an indirect elliptical representation of the afterlife of partition. Perhaps more needs to be done, perhaps engaging explicitly, but I think that's being done in Bengali. Most writers in.
My in-laws are from Dere Ghazi Khan, so that's in the western part of Pakistan. And I see a very conscious, if you like, almost negation of the language and culture on their part. So is there some research that you can share on this?
I think I'll just respond to the last point since that is what I'm currently kind of working on. So it sort of connects with those other things. When there is a repression or there is a forgetting, there is also a denial, there are also second and third generations that are so away from that history that language ceases to matter. At least in the cases that I study, it seems that the grandparents who spoke those languages are now dead and gone. And very often the second generations have refused to speak those languages, right? So this denial comes with the desire to forget because it is unpleasant, because it is traumatic. And there are also other issues in the post-colonial nation state which provided support to certain kinds of linguistic articulations, and some linguistic articulations did not get that support. Some didn't get a state or a territory and so on. So it's a much larger question, but that's a very good one. And it is beginning to happen across many languages.
Just a quick question to both of you. I must say I'm I'm in great admiration of the work that both of you have done and articulated here. I'm a service officer's daughter, sister and sister-in-law, whatever. And I feel that if Pakistan and we were to become very good friends, the Indian Army would lose its occupation. So I want to know whether this wonderful work that you're doing does percolate somewhere to our policymakers, to our political think tanks. I mean, I really wish, because we have been reading partition literature, and let me tell you that my father's, one of his first assignments in the Indian Army was on the train to Pakistan that Tutun Saint writes about. But the thing is that this wonderful research which shows the impact on an entire people and on an entire nation, why is it that these things are not read, are not looked at or considered by those making political decisions and framing policies?
Ma'am, I think there is a certain consistency in history here. When partition was decided, you had a bunch of powerful men who sat somewhere and took decisions on behalf of millions and millions of people, men and women and children. And I think its persistence, the persistence of borders, the persistence of hatred politics, also gets sustained and decided by a very small number. So even if the work we do, the stories we tell, do not percolate to them, and sometimes I think there is a very conscious way by which that percolation is not allowed to happen, I do think that it does percolate across the border quite well. Almost every few months, I have a lecture in a university in Pakistan, which I do through Skype because I'm not able to go there. There are students there who are reading things and who wants to know. So there is a, I don't want to say that this is a large people's movement, but there is some interest in civil society on both sides of the border in trying to sort of grapple with it. And even if that section enlarges, it would still be quite significant, because in any case it's not as if that section existed back then. Right?
Thank you very much, Tarun and Rita. Thank you, audience.